Good evening, honored guests and colleagues. My name is Melanie Babinski. Keshwan and I are the co-presidents of the McGill Osler Society, the oldest student society at McGill and one of the oldest Osler societies of the world. We're pleased to welcome you tonight to the 40th Annual Osler Lecture. We would like to thank the staff and the other members of the Department of Social Studies of Medicine, particularly Professor Andrea Tone for her help in organizing tonight's lecture for the Faculty of Medicine, and to thank you all for joining us at this event. Please note that tonight's lecture is being filmed, and as a courtesy, please ensure that your electronic devices are silent. Thank you. As Sir William Osler observed more than a century ago, medicine is both a human and scientific endeavor. Advances in medical research are carried out by people whose desire to help is inseparable from their personal prejudices and the biases of their era. Medical history is full of discoveries that, while improving the lives of millions, also involved experiments on some of the most vulnerable and marginalized people. These test subjects included psychiatric patients, orphan children, the poor, and prisoners who were promised pardons if they were lucky enough to survive. Tonight's lecturer, Dr. Susan Reverby, has spent decades studying the history and ethics of medical research. Since receiving her PhD in 1982, she has authored and edited 7 books and published hundreds of articles for both academic journals and the popular press. The influence of her work is evident from her long list of laurels, including 3 major academic awards for her investigation of the infamous Tuskegee Study, conducted from 1932 to 1972 by U.S. Public Health Services. It was while researching this study, in which almost 400 African Americans with latent syphilis were deceived into believing that they were being treated, that Dr. Reverby stumbled upon something even more disturbing. The U.S. government had deliberately infected about 1,500 Guatemalans with sexually transmitted diseases in the late 1940s without their knowledge or their consent. Her discovery prompted President Obama to issue a formal apology to the government of Guatemala and ignited an international conversation about the ethics of human experimentation. Tonight, she will share more about that discovery, her decisions over how and when the story should be told, and why what happened back then still matters today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Reverby speaking on infamous medical research, bad doctors, duped victims, or something else.
Thank you. I would say bonsoir, and that's the extent of my high school French. So I apologize for being the usual American who can't speak anything except our butchered version of English. And I want to thank Professor Tone and the whole department and the medical school for inviting me. My late father, who was a solo practicing physician, but really a researcher at heart, would hopefully is watching from somewhere and continues to be proud of me. So, 120 years ago, Sir William Osler promised as almost a secularized biblical proverb, "No syphilis in all its manifestations and relations, and all other things clinical will be added onto you." Without in any way substituting my own thinking to question the august physician for whom these lectures are named, I'd like to add a slightly revised modern adage. No, some infamous syphilis research in all its manifestations and relations, and all things problematic about understanding medical research will be added onto you. My proverb, obviously, is less mellifluous than Osler's, but I will argue no less true. The problem is that Osler might promise you would learn all the manifestations and relations. But when it comes to infamous medical research studies about syphilis, it is perhaps more accurate to say most people learn the 140-character Twitter version dressed up as a horror story. Bioethics is, of course, mirrored in horror, as our introducers made clear. As one scholar put it, the field was born in scandal and raised in protectionism. The advantage of horror stories is that they scare us from a distance, allow us to know fear, but to be safe from it, to have a catharsis from terror, and make possible redemption as the good guys carrying pitchforks and torches get to murder the monsters and restore order. Historical studies, particularly of particularly gruesome, almost torturous medical interventions that become known spectacles, are a form of somewhat familiar horror stories. Often mined by bioethics, their visceral power justifies the need for principles of ethical behavior in medical care and legislated state oversight interventions in research. In other words, we often need to recognize the horror in order to know what's supposed to be good. But then how do we describe and analyze the horrible in order to make the historical lessons known? I'm going tonight to discuss my own experience that demonstrates how the preconceived assumptions of melodramatic history, and especially those that link medical research to racial topics, make truth-seeking difficult, and therefore the historical lessons to be learned more blurred than we imagine. I will argue that melodrama makes for great horror, but is a poor basis for which to understand the seeking of justice. My scholarship, as you heard, has focused on two troubling studies in American medical research history, both of which led to public apologies by US presidents. The first, as you heard, the US Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in the male Negro, better known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. So this is the edited book I did that's about different sides and how people looked at the study, and this is the book I wrote that was about my perception of the history of it and how it travels into American culture, and for which then President Bill Clinton apologized in 1997. And then the other study, as you heard, the US Public Health Service inoculation sexually transmitted diseases studies in Guatemala, 1946 to 48, that did receive worldwide attention, at least for 5 minutes anyway. A US government apology to Guatemala 7 years ago now, and reports from commissions in both the US and Guatemala. So this is an example of the coverage of the study the day it came out in Prensa Libre, which is the major paper in Guatemala City. This was above the fold, as they say in the business, on the New York Times. And this is a coverage in a paper in England. And this is the cover of the Guatemalan government's report, and this is the cover of the US Bioethics Commission's report. Each of these studies involved the powerful US government, focused on primarily poor and rural African American men in one case, and Guatemalan sex workers, mental patients, soldiers, and prisoners, many of whom were Mayan, in the other. Each entailed deceptions, lack of any serious consenting processes, and life-threatening sexually transmitted diseases. The study in Tuskegee, which I'm sure many of you know about, went on for 4 decades as hundreds of African American men, 439 who already had late-stage syphilis, and 185 controls. So they have to tell you that when the controls got syphilis, they switched them into the to the syphilitic arm. When the syphilitics didn't show syphilis on their autopsies, they were never switched into that. So the data is a disaster. But they were watched and not supposed to be treated. They were told, however, that the aspirins and vitamin tonics were treatment, and even that a diagnostic spinal tap was, quote, special treatment. So I want to introduce you. These are some of the men. The PHS, the Public Health Service, took pictures in the mid-50s. So these are some of the men in the study then. This is Eunice Rivers, the African-American nurse, who's the key go-between the men and the PHS, handing out aspirins to one of the men in the study. This is her handing a vitamin tonic to a man in the fields, and this is the picture they took of the spinal tap. The study in Guatemala, in contrast, extended for 2 years, although possibly longer, depending on which report, recruited nearly 1,500 men and women, or just over 2,000, according to the Guatemalan government, and involved infecting them with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid, and then not treating the majority of them after the infecting. So these are some of the pictures that were in the reports of a woman where they're measuring the chancre on her arm. This is a slide of just the different kinds of experiments that were done. And this is my article that led to all of this information. Each study, of course, conjures up almost primordial and powerful fears of our lack of control over our own bodies, the dangers of those with great power, the terror of trusting physician, researcher, scientists who respond with what many see as close to medical torture. the racism of treating people of color as the other, both in the US South and the global South. So here's a slide that just gives you a quick comparison of the two studies. In the Guatemala study, the people are actually being infected with the diseases, and people are supposed to be treated in the study with penicillin, but not everyone becomes infected. It's not clear even how many were ever cured. In the Tuskegee study, the men were not already had the disease and supposed to be in late latency. That meant they were no longer infectious, and their wives and sexual partners may or may not have been treated, and the men were supposed to be kept from treatment, although I argued in my book that a number of them got out, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Each research study project has physical procedures that are fairly horrific and pornographic. Diagnostic spinal taps, a special treatment in Tuskegee, the use of sex workers, spinal punctures, and the abrading of men's penises and women's cervixes to deliver the disease inoculums in Guatemala. Now, a historian finds the facts for these kinds of studies in multiple and the usual ways. We read primary materials in archives, we do interviews, we calculate statistical data. We often don't know, actually, what meaning we or others will make of the material once we have it, for of course it in part depends on what kind of narrative we create, what existing metaphors we develop or struggle against, and the kinds of facts that can both find and explain, before the term fake facts, of course, came into usage. None of this, however, has ever been easy, especially in the face of strong beliefs about what the stories are supposed to be about and the seemingly obvious bioethical lessons to be derived. Given rumors and other explanations too, my efforts required acknowledging and knowing what the beliefs already are, even as I try and say what else might be known. And in the face of a media onslaught over these horrific issues, the difficulties of remaining the careful, thoughtful academic who always wants to say things are more complex, which we always do, right, becomes even harder. How then was it possible to do this at all, and should I have even tried? I found some comfort in thinking through the problem of melodramas, spectacles, and tragedies as a way to understand my experiences. I found particularly useful this quote from the late film director Sidney Lumet, who wrote, "In a well-written drama, the story comes out of the characters. The characters in a well-written melodrama come out of the story." Historians, of course, want to be writing dramas where our historical figures create the story within a historical context, not melodramas where we already know what the story is and the characters just fill in the usual parts. When it comes to public discussions and fictional representation of racism and imperialism, and especially in the context of medical research, I want to argue, it is, however, often the melodrama where the story drives the characters happens first. Film critic Linda Williams provided some of a guide here, too, in her analysis of the melodrama of race that gets seen in the United States in both actual experiences and in books, plays, and films. And her book was called Playing the Race Card. These kinds of melodramas, she argued, are so embedded in American national consciousness, they're almost impossible to escape. She contends that these kinds of simple spectacles and tragedies performed in melodramatic tones are the ways we talk, view, and organize our thinking about race, even when we think we are not doing this, and even when we wish to escape it. Now, I first realized melodrama would be a problem when I began to lecture on the initial work I was doing on the study in Tuskegee 2 decades ago. I was confronted with the belief, I'm sure you've seen this a million times, if you know anything about this, that the men in the study had been given syphilis by the United States Public Health Service, not had the disease already. And in the early years before the internet, I spent more time than I think writing letters, calling ABC News in the middle of the night to say, I'm sorry, your national correspondent just got this wrong, and trying desperately to correct this. And then after a while, I just gave up because it was impossible. This belief, of course, is enforced when images of the blood draws in Alabama are cropped to just show a white hand on a syringe as the needle enters a black arm, even a black on black arm. And I'll show you that in a minute. So this This is Nurse Rivers doing the blood draw using a Keitel tube. This is one of the physicians also doing the blood draw. And you can see, if you look carefully, obviously it's a blood draw, you can see him pulling the syringe back, but I'll show you what this looks like in a minute when it gets cropped to show something different. To understand why this belief still circulates is to accept the study was never, from its first public exposure in July of 1972, just an historical event or even just a bioethics tale. It became an American allegory, a way to explain the dangers and fears that lurk every time a patient or subject places their lives in someone else's hands, whether for clinical care or a research trial. And more commonly as a way to speak, I think, about racism without directly naming it. There is a reason some of the earliest horror stories and films focus on the dangers of an unchecked medical madness and the sexualized power of doctors over the innocent. So think about The Cabinet of Dr. Kilgari, The Island of Lost Souls, or of course Frankenstein. The assumption that in Tuskegee there was infecting with a deadly disease fits this old trope. The monster doctors are infecting the vulnerable story is a powerful tale, even if failing to treat and deception, as was done in Tuskegee, is in some ways, I think, a much more normative and in many ways more horrible and even more racist, I have argued, for its familiarity. After all, how many have been denied treatment because it could not be afforded, could not get to it, were afraid to access it, or were treated badly, or didn't even know it was a problem? Again, this is some of the men in the study, just to introduce you to them and let you see what they look like. For the study in Tuskegee, along with slavery and lynching, becomes yet another example of what happens when African Americans are not valued as rights-bearing citizens. In retelling this story, I relied upon interviews, statistical data from the men's medical records, which had opened up while I was doing the research, and a rereading of the correspondence to argue that many, in fact, had escaped to treatment, especially if they survived into the antibiotic era after 1945. The study, remember, goes on for another almost 20 years till 72. By the end of the study and before its public exposure, the US Public Health Service researchers had to admit to one another it had become a study of undertreated rather than untreated syphilis. My historical counting tried to show that even Mr. Herman Shaw, shown here at the federal apology with President Clinton, the spokesman for the study's last survivors at the apology, in fact himself got to treatment in the 50s, even if it was by accident. He got pneumonia, and so he's hospitalized, and they gave him IV penicillin for 10 days. And he lived till he was 94, and he's the spokesman for the men, so think about this and the irony of all of that. The researchers, I argued, of the researchers' control, therefore, was never complete. This is the last of, this is the 5 men. There were 6 men still alive in 1997 when we got the apology. They're now all passed, and so have all their wives. The researchers' control was never complete, but the story of undertreatment and the possibility of escape, however, cannot, of course, balance the revulsion toward a government that knowingly let its citizens be harmed and even wrote about it in 15 published articles over the decades. My evidence of these kinds of escapes reminds us, of course, that subjects can undermine studies in hidden ways. It tells us that the historical truths are often more complicated than a simple horror story with villains, victims, and good guys. It is still difficult, however, to counter the powerful melodrama or the ease of a simple victim story that becomes the basis for federal rulemaking, was taught in whispers, constantly used in lectures and media accounts and in online ethics courses. For in trying to understand how some of the men might have escaped the study, I had to consider the complicated roles of the African-American nurse central to the story and the vagaries of control over African-American lives in the era of the Great Migration to the North and West of Black Americans out of the rural South, and the need to have the story told in particular ways. Now, the problem of trying to escape a medical melodrama became even clearer as the news of the study in Guatemala became a worldwide phenomenon. I was happily in the archives in this nondescript building at the University of Pittsburgh in 2003 to examine the papers of a former US Surgeon General when the archivist asked, did I want to look at the papers of John C. Cutler, who had taught at Pitt for decades? Now, Cutler was mostly an et al. At the end of a long list of names on several of the articles written about the syphilis study in Tuskegee, a minor character really in the story, mostly remembered because he lived long enough to be in the films that were made in '92 when it was 20 years after the study had ended. And he has, as you'll see in a minute, a kind of pinched face, weird syntax, and piercing eyes. I think he looks a little bit like Liam Neeson in Schindler's List. That doesn't help, push this. And he continued to defend the study as appropriate science and good for African Americans on these documentaries 20 years after the study ended. And that was the part that was so amazing. I mean, after 20 years, it would have been really simple to say, oh, gee, we thought it was a long time ago. We thought about race differently. So sorry, we've moved on. I mean, you can imagine what a PR agent might have done it, and he doesn't do it. So I'll give you a sense of this. Those of you who know, this is actually, let me see if I can figure out how to, hold on. Sorry, this is the one thing we didn't test. Let me get the mouse to do this. There's a, okay, here we go. All right, here's Cutler.
We have no compunction about sending our youth away to the war when it's in the national interest. And in terms of syphilis, was a leading cause of infant maternal mortality, leading single cause of admission to mental hospitals, and many other things. So it was in the national interest to get the information so that you could provide the greatest protection for the entire community, black and white.
So here he is in '92 justifying Tuskegee and thinking of himself, and I've written a longer piece about this, as a general in a war against syphilis in which he, as the general, has the right to order whoever has to be sent off into the battle, right? So here he is in another film. This was seen, more widely this was done by PBS, in which he's, and listen to the beginning part of this. Sorry. Okay, here we go. All right.
My regret is, in terms of the study, I have none.
All right, that's amazing. And right? First of all, the language is just weird because the syntax is bizarre. But it's also, I have no regrets. It's 1992. What do you mean you have no regrets? So a lot of us just were completely horrified by him, as you can well imagine. So meanwhile, so there I am, remember, back in this nondescript archive looking for more on Tuskegee, and maybe something that could explain Cutler's views. And I opened his papers, hoping perhaps to find more. Instead, I found thousands of pages, laboratory and experimental reports, and photographs with the cover. This is the cover page that I found that said, experimental studies on human inoculation in syphilis, chancroid, and gonorrhea. And then there were millions of pictures of some of the people without, this is after this has been doctored by the Bioethics Commission, but they didn't have the black things across their faces, so I could see everybody's face. And this is Cutler as a young man, as a young physician running this study. Now, the papers were for a study that, as far as I knew, no one had ever heard about. Tuskegee had 15 publications, remember, and this study appeared to have taken place in Guatemala between 46 and 48 when Cutler was only 31 years old, and for those of you in med school, only 4 years out from medical school. That's what he looked like in 1946. Now remember, I had spent a decade at that point explaining to everyone that no one was given syphilis in Tuskegee, and here was Cutler and inoculation. As I read, the story became increasingly horrific. Here are the key facts I could glean from his report and the extensive correspondence left in his papers. The studies in Guatemala were approved by the all-white male, as you can imagine at that point in time, syphilis study section of the National Research Council as a grant to NIH and to the Guatemalan government. The purpose of the study was to obtain information about methods of prophylaxis against syphilis, to increase our understanding of the effects of penicillin in the treatment of syphilis, and to assist in a better understanding of some of the serology. So remember, this is 1946. Penicillin has just proven 2 or 3 years earlier to be something that will treat early syphilis, and they're really interested in the question of prophylaxis. That is, could could penicillin be used to prevent infection after someone had been exposed to the disease, but before they evinced the disease itself? And the government had a lot of things it was using at the time. Any of you old enough to have been in the Second World War, and this is what historians of syphilis do. They type syphilis into eBay, and they win things like a tube of prophylaxis from 1942. And the problem with this is that it burned, and there was, as you can well imagine, given where it was put, that there wasn't a whole lot of compliance with the use of this. So they're really interested in this question of, could a different prophylaxis be used? Would penicillin do it? They were also testing something called Orbis Mafarsin. And so they were interested in all those kinds of questions. And they had tried to do some previous experiments that Cutler had been involved in at the Terre Haute Federal Penitentiary in '43, and they got the prisoners to, quote, volunteer, but many of the men did not get infected. As we all know, sexually transmitted infections, despite years of being told this, we usually don't get it on toilet seats, right? You have to have a sexually transmission. So they were having trouble getting this to work. Now, unlike Tuskegee, remember, this study did involve infecting. So one of the reasons Guatemala is chosen is, of course, with an STI. How do you transmit? Now, in Guatemala, prostitution was legal, and even more importantly, inmates in the federal penitentiary in Guatemala City were allowed to bring sex workers into the prison for their services. Cutler and Juan Funes, who is co-investigator and head of the Guatemalan Venereal Disease Division, recruited sex workers who already had STIs or they infected them, and then used, this is the part that got the newspaper people, US taxpayer dollars to pay them to ply their trade with the prisoners. Despite this, and even providing of alcoholic drinks to the occasion to mimic what Cutler called normal exposure, the inmates were opposed to many of the blood draws for testing and proved slightly recalcitrant, since if you could get sex for very little at that point, it wasn't such a big incentive. Cutler and Funes began to do blood testing at an orphanage. Then they moved on to Guatemala's only mental hospital and army barracks. Here they began to make the inoculum from infected rabbits that were sent from Johns Hopkins and street strains of the disease they found in the sex workers. And they began to inoculate the inmates and soldiers in a variety of ways: skin contact, direct injection, scarification, abrasion, and cisternal punctures. The details were pretty horrendous, as were the photos taken by, and this is the irony of all ironies, by Elise Cutler, John Cutler's spouse, an alum of the college where I teach. So of all the juke joints in all the world, she showed up at mine. And these are the pictures. So you can see they're measuring the chancre on this person's arm. They're measuring the penis to look for the chancre. And this is a really good example of the hundreds of medical reports that I found. The circles are mine. So this tells you that they were using the Nichols rabbit strain of the disease. They took a cotton pledgelet, and they held this man's penis for an hour and a half, and they kept dripping the inoculum onto it. The pledgelet was removed at 9:44. It was put on at 8:16. So you can imagine the imagery of what was going on is horrendous. And at the hospital, they offered Dilantin for epileptics, who were a large part of the population in that institution. They also bought, and frankly, this was the sentence that upset me the most, because it reminded me of, $24 and beads for Manhattan. They also bought, quote, a refrigerator for biologicals, a motion picture projector that supplied the sole recreation for the inmates, metal cups, plates, and forks to supplement the completely inadequate supply available. And individual subjects were offered cigarettes, an entire packet for inoculation, and blood draws or spinal taps, and a single cigarette for clinical observation. Malaria specialist G. Robert Coatney, who had done prison malaria studies himself, visited the project in February of '47, and in reporting to Cutler after he returned to the States, he explained he had brought Surgeon General Thomas Perrin up to date, and that, quote, with a merry twinkle that came into his eye, Perrin said, we can't do such an experiment in this country, although some people have argued that it was really about the use of sex workers more than anything else, so it's hard to know exactly what Perrin meant on the occasion. But they knew that they were on an edge. For R.C. Arnold, one of the discoverers of the use of penicillin for syphilis, who supervised Cutler, wrote him and said, I am a bit, in fact, more than a bit leery of the experiment with the insane people. They cannot give consent, don't know what's going on, and if some goody organization got wind of the work, they would raise a lot of smoke. I couldn't believe they wrote this. It was just amazing to read. You can't imagine what it was like sitting in that archive reading this stuff. I think the soldiers, he says, would be best, or the prisoners, for they can give consent, but they never consented them. There's no evidence of any consenting. Maybe I'm too conservative, he said. Also, how many knew what was going on? I realized that a patient or a dozen could be infected, develop the disease, and be cured before anything would be suspected. In the report, I see no reason to say where the work was done and the type of, quote, volunteer. Now, the numbers were really confusing. The Bioethics Commission did this kind of numbers, said there were total number of subjects. That means somebody could have been given it multiple times. It doesn't mean an individual. This is how many they thought were intendedly exposed. This is how many they think had testing. There were also 83 deaths during the period. There is absolutely, by the way, no evidence that any of this created the deaths. You wouldn't know that from the coverage, but that's really true. And Guatemala claims 2,082 people were exposed. This is a kind of the data you can get from the federal report. This was given at one of the statements by one of the Bioethics Commission people. And the number, I just want to remind you, at the bottom on the far right is that out of 1,308 exposed, this is the number they think got some kind of treatment. So it's a little less than half. I could not tell any of that from what I was looking for. It took them a very long time. And the other thing I want to remind you is that literally on the last page of the Commission's 154-page report, they say very clearly they had a really good sexually transmitted disease physician from Johns Hopkins Medical School do all the data analysis. But they said the Commission did not attempt to identify how many people were clinically infected or how many people received adequate treatment. As a result, the database focuses on the number of individuals exposed to rather than infected with an STD. That's a pretty big difference to kind of leave at the back of the page. Now, you can obviously argue that doing the study itself is horrendous enough, but we don't really know how many people in the end were I mean, you can say you were harmed by having this done to you. I certainly can make that argument, but this also doesn't show us how many people really got infected at all. Right. So what should a historian do with this kind of information? Now, without a research team, remember, I actually just retired this last year, but I taught at a small women's college in the United States. I don't have a slew of graduate students, and my sister's the epidemiologist in the family, but not me. So without a research team trained in biostatistics, which both the Centers for Disease Control and the Presidential Commission had and then spent months on, and I'll explain that in a minute, I made the decision not to attempt to analyze the thousands of pages of very messy data. This was 2003, and I still had the Tuskegee data, which had just become available to code. And the book would take another 5 years to finish. Furthermore, Cutler claimed in his written report and in his correspondence that this had been a study to explore, in part, the use of penicillin and Orbis marfacin as a prophylaxis. Thus, coming to the material, and this is always where the thing that's in your head structures what you can visibly see. I came to the material with my knowledge of the study in Tuskegee, the idea that this study in Guatemala, while it involved infecting and it was horrendous, also appeared to be one of treating. Remember, I'm studying a study where no one is at least attended to get treatment, even if they escape to it. Without a careful analysis of the statistical materials, it was impossible to know if all of the subject had or had not been treated. Even after all of the research, as I said, of the Bioethics Commission couldn't even determine this themselves. So I began to discuss the Guatemala material quietly with others. However, when I finally finished the last edits on the book 5 years later, the Guatemala material seemed too complicated and too unfresh in my mind to fit, especially since I had been forced to cut 100 pages out of the book. So in July of 2009, with the book on Tuskegee completed and my teaching responsibilities done for the year, I returned to the Pittsburgh archives and redid the research to be clear on what I had found. You know, it's that thing that every researcher has, that little project in your file cabinet that you're going to come back to. And that's what this felt like, a good follow-up to the Tuskegee work. Now, given other teaching and service demands on my time, it took me until March of 2010, so about another 8 months, to write the Guatemala material up and to give it at a paper at the American Association for the History of Medicine in May. But I have to tell you, you'll appreciate this. I was in Rochester, Minnesota, where you can't get anywhere except flying to Minneapolis and then 3 other airplanes to get home. And I was on Sunday on the last day and the last session. So there weren't a lot of people in the audience. I'm sure you've all experienced this, right? But I also shared the write-up the month before with a wonderful person who's now passed named David Senser, the former CDC director whom I had become friends with as I had interviewed him about Tuskegee. David played an incredibly important role in the Tuskegee study. He was the CDC's longest-running director. He was himself an infectious disease doc. But in 1969, he chaired a meeting at a crucial turning point in the study. In Tuskegee, there had been people beginning to make noise about what was going on, and in that meeting, they make the decision, the crucial decision, to keep the study going until it just blows up in the press 3 years later. A Students for Democratic Society, the left student organizing group at Emory, even burned Dave in effigy outside the CDC offices after the story of the study broke in '72. So this time, I think he was determined to do it right and to protect his former organization. So it was Senser so I called him as my, now I'm a historian of medicine, but I'm not a physician, and the thing that always scares historians of medicine, or should, is you don't want to make a medical mistake. You don't want to give out this paper and say something really stupid that shows that, of course, people like me should never have been given PhDs in the history of medicine because we don't know the difference between A and B. So I had Dave, as my aging syphilologist, look at this to check the science, right? To make sure I didn't do it wrong. So he was the one who said that this paper needed to be given to officials at CDC, something I, of course, had not even considered. So here he is. This is actually just before he died in 2011, explaining to an Australian filmmaker what happened. So here, oops, sorry, I didn't do that right. Let's get this here. Okay, here we go. We'll start in a sec.
Susan sent me an email saying that she had a paper she'd like me to look at for scientific purposes. And as I began reading it, it was a description of the work that had been done in Guatemala. And I immediately called back to Susan. I said, this isn't a scientific problem that you've got. We've got a problem of public relations, and it needs to be not buried in some obscure journal. We did not.
So here's the funny part about it. I said, Dave, nobody reads, historic. I was putting it in something called the Journal of Policy History, which I don't even read. So I thought nobody would pick it up. And, the problem is when you're a historian of medicine, there are a lot of horror stories out there. And and one of our senior guys in the field said, how many more of these do we need to know about? So, at that point, I wasn't sure. And I think what's interesting in Dave's comment, if you listen to it, he says, we have a political problem. But in fact, I didn't have a political problem. CDC might have had a political problem. So what he did, which was really kind, is he gave it to these two wonderful human beings. The man on the top left is Harold Jaffe, who just retired as the senior associate director for science. And some of you who go back in the AIDS epidemic and saw the Randy Schiltz film, called And the Band Played On. There's a little short Jewish man who is from the CDC. That's Harold. So we all had jokes about if this ever turned into a movie, who was going to play Harold this time. And then this gentleman, John Douglas, who was then the head of the STI division, and he was sent to go look at all the materials. So they asked me to send them my notes. So, it was hilarious. My partner and I, we cleaned up my spelling errors in my notes, right? We took all our Xeroxes. We went to a Xerox store, and we quietly, Xeroxed everything. I felt like I was in the middle of the Pentagon Papers. And we mailed them to Dave at home, not to Harold at the CDC, because that way no one could ever FOIA it. That is a Freedom of Information Act request. God forbid they didn't do anything about this, then they couldn't be held responsible. So it went only to Dave. And I sent that material. They immediately read all this and my draft paper, and they sent John Douglas, their leading syphilologist, to look at the materials and to begin to make some sense of the data. He had biostatisticians on his staff, and it took them a couple of months to play with the data. So over the summer of 2010, it was making it up the chain of command from CDC's offices to the National Institute of Health, and then finally to the White House Domestic Policy Council. Now, I was in on a number of the emails and phone discussions, but most of this took place above my pay grade, as you can imagine, and my contacts. I agreed that my not yet published paper would be made available on my college's website when the government apology, which is how they finally decided how to handle it, was announced on October 1st, 2010. So I had the authority of my college behind me, and I didn't put it on my book webpage because I didn't want to look like some whistleblower who was trying to shill a book. Now, most historians are not trained to write what-if claims, but there are several worth considering here since I have been criticized publicly and in writing for not releasing the material initially in 2003. Remember, I held on to it for another 5 years. I did not have any contact with Dave Sensor in 2003, and it took several years for the friendship to build up so that we trusted one another. Before that, he was really just someone I went to interview. In 2003, I had just begun to write the book on Tuskegee, although my edited book was definitely out. And even if I had written the Guatemala material up in 2003, I would not have had the authority that finishing the book on Tuskegee would give me years later, nor, I think, the analysis that would not have fed into a kind of horror story approach because I hadn't figured that out yet. Furthermore, I didn't have the CDC context. So the story had legs in 2010, as they say in the newspaper business, because the apology from the US government, not just what I found, as one of my medical history friends put it, the US doesn't usually apologize to foreigners. And I think that's about right. So without those contacts, I doubt it would have been picked up. Furthermore, Zeke Emanuel, the bioethicist who's on the top here, was in 2010 the Obama administration's point person on healthcare. He had written on the exploitation of subjects, was involved in proposals that were wending their way up the chain of command there to change regulations about human subject protection, and he knew my work. He also pushed for the apology, and finally considered that we don't know whether during the George Bush presidency, which was what was going on in 2003 in the United States, anyone would have taken seriously the need to apologize for this or to have their bioethics commission investigate it, even if I had been able to get anyone to pay attention. So it leaves us with a version of, if an historian finds something in the archives and shouts out, will somebody listen? Do we have responsibility to blog everything substantial we find and hope it will be picked up? Should every historian have a government official on speed dial, right? What if I had tried to publish this immediately in 2003? Would it have mattered? I don't know. And finally, we'll never know because we can't run this experiment over again, right? What I wasn't prepared for, though, and I think I should have been, was the melodrama that followed. By September, I knew that both Secretaries Clinton and Sebelius, one was Secretary of State and the other one was Secretary of Health and Human Services, would be apologizing, and that President Obama would be calling President Colom in Guatemala. Colom invoked the terms first used against the Armenian genocide and called the studies. So here are the two secretaries calling it abhorrent and unethical, and President Colom called it a crime against humanity. The president also asked his commission on bioethical issues to explore the history, as you know, and other human subject protections. I was stunned, actually, that it had taken us years, because I was part of the group that got the apology for Tuskegee, to get that apology, and now this was happening in government speak in a matter of months. Remember, I'm talking to Dave in March or April of 2010. The apology is October. That's really fast. I still didn't think it was going to get much coverage, so you don't want to go to Las Vegas with me and bet on what I know, because I'm clearly bad at this. What I had not been told by the federal government, however, was that they had given the story to Robert Bazell, NBC science correspondent, the night before. I agreed to post my uncopy-edited article on my faculty webpage, thank God for tenure, right, at 9 a.m. Bazell already knew about it and had reported it on MSNBC by 9:02. By 9:05, he reached me at home, and by 9:30, there was an NBC News crew in our house, and the entire world's media began calling because I gave out my cell phone number as the contact, because I had, and the PR people at my college had no idea that this was going to blow up. Quickly, it became clear that much of the press wanted to know, first, how had this happened, of course, and how did I feel when I found it? And how monstrous really was Dr. Cutler, the PHS doctor who had run the studies? And which one was worse, again, Guatemala or Tuskegee? So this is the Australian news thing that happened. And so you can see again, see the picture, this is the blood draw. Now, if you look at that, you might know, right, that this is a syringe being pulled down, but to someone not knowing that, it certainly looks like he might be infecting this man with something in the syringe. This is one of the gentlemen who claimed in Guatemala that he had been harmed. I was actually in Tuskegee giving a talk, so we were doing the interview literally in the graveyard where some of the men are buried, and that's why I look really very hot and bothered, because there also were fire ants, and we were trying to move around them. So you want the inside story of how these things happen. And notice the title, Infected, right? Which is, of course, what didn't happen in Tuskegee. I was completely horrified, but I had no control over this. How did I feel? I couldn't believe they asked me this. Why did anyone, I thought at first, care about how I felt? And it felt like a kind of, when did you stop beating your wife kind of question? Because if I said I was shocked that this kind of study had gone on, one reporter wrote that I was naive and didn't understand how normative this was for medicine, right? If I said I was not surprised, then I sounded as if I was a callous and thoughtless human being. Others made me sound as if I were just, this is my favorite, some girl researcher who had accidentally found this material that was being hidden away, rather than a scholar who knew what she was looking at, if not at least for current news value, and could write it up in a historically nuanced manner. No one seems to have remembered my favorite Pasteur aphorism, chance favors the prepared mind, right? I was also asked, wasn't Cutler a Nazi doctor like Mengele, who had found refuge in Latin America? And in fact, in Prensa Libre, the next day, there's Uncle Sam looking at Mengele, right, in the mirror. I tried really hard to put Cutler in context, to discuss the ways in which his higher-ups were not so sure. Remember the quote from Arnold, this was acceptable research, but they had still let it go on. I was trying to explain why the Public Health Service was so concerned about syphilis and the search for a chemical prophylaxis to prevent infection after exposure. The melodrama, however, proved a much more powerful story. Cutler became a Nazi doctor, although there was indeed some worry in Guatemala that there were many other crucial things to worry about. So in this cartoon, Secretary Clinton is explaining to President Colom, and the Guatemalan man is saying on the side, gee, what about besides the Cold War, the paramilitary groups, the demand for drugs, and the hate towards immigrants, not to mention that we overthrew their government in 1954, right? The Guatemalans instead became hopeless and pure victims, although once it became clear enough, even when I tried to explain it, that the US government couldn't walk into the federal penitentiary, the country's only mental hospital, and an army barracks in Guatemala City in 1946 without permission, that the Guatemalan government was deeply involved in it, just as the physicians at Tuskegee Institute had been with that study, even if obviously there's an enormous power differential. Why governments or medical professionals might agree to such a study in their under-resourced area never gets much attention. It's certainly not as interesting as the melodrama. The internal racism also within Guatemala got very little initial play, except among Guatemalan scholars. Much of the story then, in October of 2010, depending on who wrote it and where in the world it went, and I got calls from everybody from the BBC to Al Jazeera to the Chinese news agency, and it played out with all the melodrama of the bodily physical violations, the use of US taxpayer dollars to infect sex workers and send them into prison to ply their trade, the power of the US government in a global South country, innocent victims, the horror of the abuse of medical research authority, at the same time as the US was prosecuting Nazi doctors at Nuremberg, and the sexual nature of it all. Again, the emotions of the responses of the government secretaries used the words abhorrent and terrible. My own finding and those of the Guatemalan people, and the people in Guatemala galvanized the press coverage that went around the world. At least 3 filmmakers also made contact, and of course 4 tort lawyers. Quickly, the heads of the CDC and NIH also sent out a short article to the Journal of the American Medical Association that denounced what had happened, explained the protections that are now in place, and tried to assure everyone that this could, of course, never happen again. Thus, the melodrama of a bad doctor, a differing time, and innocent victims played out against the apology for wrongdoing set in another country and at another time. So again, this is what the 2 reports that came out from our government. This is the one from the Guatemalans. The Bioethics Commission report a year later made clear the institutional support that made the study possible and issued a claim of blameworthiness against the doctors who ran it. Even though they struggled not to tell the story as a melodrama, the news reports picked up on the numbers who had died and the vividness of the case examples. As you might imagine, a law firm found 7 individuals in Guatemala who claimed to have been harmed by the studies, and they filed a lawsuit against the United States under something called the Alien Tort Statute of 1789 that allows U.S. courts to hear claims from non-U.S. citizens about breaches of law outside our borders. The suit was dismissed, and the U.S. has more quietly provided about $1 million for ethics and STD training in Guatemala as kind of a reparation. In the last few years, however, another lawsuit has developed. This time, and this is a really interesting one, and we should still be following this time suing Johns Hopkins University, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the drug company that provided the penicillin for complicity in the study on behalf of 854 people who claim to be the relatives of the people who were affected. The claim is that 70 years ago, faculty at Hopkins and leaders at the Rockefeller Foundation, quote, helped design, support, develop, encourage, and finance, and participated in and benefited from the study. They're asking for $1 billion in compensatory and punitive damages, and they've made it through a number of challenges. The lawsuit is still proceeding in the courts in Maryland. And finally, in December of 2015, the Archdiocese of Guatemala filed a suit at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights against the U.S. and Guatemala for, quote, human rights violation and crimes against humanity. As civil rights attorney Robert Garcia, who brought the suit, has argued, quote, apologies are not good enough. Truth and reconciliation requires treatment, compensation, and restorative justice. So in conclusion, the scholarly literature on race and melodrama warns us that it will be very difficult ever to escape melodrama when it comes to the horror stories in medical research, and my own struggles back up that analysis. I accept that the first steps, but only the first steps to change, requires there be an acknowledgement that something horrible has happened. I tried in many of the media interviews to remind people that an apology only does that. It acknowledges an error or a wrong, but it does not predict or control future behavior. I made an effort to make sure the differences between what happened in Tuskegee and Guatemala were clear, even if the same seemingly bad guy doctor linked them together, and I refused to vote on which one was worse, the study in Tuskegee or Guatemala. I have, over the last 7 years, spent much time helping medical personnel to understand that they should try and imagine how they could be Cutler, not just how they should not be him. That is, I really I felt like I had this, I gave another paper on this, I mentioned that, really tried hard to think about how he got into this. If you don't think that he's just a sociopath, why, and why did he think this was good research? Why did the people who supported him do that? What made this normative in some ways and what didn't it? I think it's really important if we're going to learn anything. So I made the case that today, with widespread globalization of clinical trials, how we regulate and watch over human subject research in other countries really matters. I have argued that a search for other terrible studies might be worthwhile if we can compensate those harmed, but focusing on what we are doing now really matters almost as much, if not more. I made an effort to explain a binary of endless medical research and violation of human rights are not necessary, even if just making more regulations are not the solutions. I have argued we need to avoid just thinking about a simple good and evil or emphasize the individuals in stock melodramatic stories while we pretend that the structural factors that create the problems in the first place can be ignored. In the end, I think that melodrama reminds us of the horror of the stories, in part to motivate us to actually begin to think and take action. But it cannot stop there. In the face of, quote, moral confusion and disarray, literary critic Linda Williams concludes, melodrama is organized around a paradoxical quest for full articulation of truth and virtue at precisely those junctures when truth and virtue are most vexed. And yet the stories of the study in Tuskegee and Guatemala may not seem vexed at all to most who only hear about it through rumor, quick media accounts, or the emotion of the horrible and the abhorrent. The melodrama of these two studies helps us to begin to focus these concerns. Whether we just weep, frankly, or make change depends on how we understand why these studies happen in the first place and how much the emotion motivates us toward complex changes in social policy, not just in wringing our hands, moaning over simple evil by seemingly bad men, and making up more procedural regulations. Melodrama makes for emotive but ultimately limited theater, as all of us know who have sat through them, and even for really good performative apologies. Similarly, melodramatic history may get us to pay attention, but it is ultimately, I think, a poor guide to making social policy and to achieving justice. Only the real drama, I think, can do that, and that our effort to find ways to provide compensation and remediation for those who are harmed, to punish those who perpetuated these crimes, and attempt to understand why they happened in the first place is in the interest, in the end, of both better science, better medicine, and above all, for justice. Thank you. Okay, sure.
All right, so thank you so much, Dr. Reverby. So we will be now accepting questions from the audience for Dr. Reverby.
Oh, this gentleman has the mic. So for all of us with hearing aids, I really appreciate this. Thank you. Yes. Yes. So, questions? I have lights in my head, so I can't see you. So somebody's going to have to stand up or holler. This is like my class. Okay, people in the back, do you have an idea? Questions? Yeah, here we go.
Hello. Testing. Can everyone hear me? Fantastic. Thank you for that very stimulating lecture.
Thank you.
I think it's clear to everyone that these experiments were ethically abhorrent. They're ethically abhorrent today. My question is, were they ethically abhorrent in the times that they were conducted? And if so, have ethics changed in that time? And then a related question would be, do you foresee any upcoming changes in ethics that would, or our perception of ethics, or what is ethical, that would change research in the future?
Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the past. You have to understand, historians hate preventive history. We don't really try to practice it. So at the time, what's fascinating about this, and that's really one of the contrasts in it. Remember, the Tuskegee Study had 15 published articles in pretty major American journals, although the men were, toward the end, referred to as volunteers. So you'd have to read it really carefully to get a sense of what was going on. And there were, I wrote a whole chapter in my book called Why Didn't It Stop? And they weren't trying to hide it. At one point, when a physician raised concerns in the 50s, one of the doctors running the study invited him to come down and see what they were doing. So this was, believe me, not being done on an island, you know, off with no information. They thought they really that this was an important study, that they really needed this information. And like a lot of studies, and the way I try to help people think about it is, imagine if tomorrow we had an easily available vaccine that would cure HIV/AIDS, right? That it would prevent HIV/AIDS. So all of the money for HIV/AIDS research, which at least in the United States funds a lot of people, would dry up, right? Because you just give out this vaccine and nobody would get the disease anymore, become like measles and mumps, right? So if you think about that, that's what penicillin's doing to syphilis in the 40s. They begin to think that since it's it's only going to take a couple of shots of penicillin to cure someone, that it's going to go away. And in fact, the VD division loses a lot of money. And one of the reasons Cutler doesn't stay in Guatemala any longer is there's no money to keep him there, because no one's really interested in this research very much at that point, because everybody's just going to get penicillin. So that study wasn't hidden. The Guatemala one, there's a young historian of medicine at Harvard who's now doing his dissertation on the study, and I'm hoping he'll find some more material. People told me quietly that there were rumors about it within the STD division of the CDC. And I'm sure any of you know who have gone to medical school, and you probably hear this in medical practices, there's always a rumor about something awful that took place at some point in the past at your institution. So my guess is that people sort of knew about it. But what was fascinating is in a journal called Medicine, one of the big American medical journals, in 53, there's a long, like 50-page study on the whole history of inoculation, syphilis, and what we found. Cutler is like, number 50 of the people who wrote this study up, and Guatemala is never mentioned. So I think it's really interesting that by then, I don't know whether it was the impact of Nuremberg or everybody got nervous, and because the data was such a mess, so he never published it. And I had gone through the whole STD division's records in the American National Archives, and nothing was there about it. So I think the only person who kept all this material was Cutler. And he had this enormous career, and he ended up only giving these papers, that's all that was in there, which is just fascinating. Why did he, I can't answer the question, why did he give those papers? And then at one point I just thought maybe, because they lived in the same house for a really long time in Pittsburgh, and I had these visions of his wife saying, oh, for God's sakes, John, those things are molding in the basement. Could you just please get rid of them? And so he doesn't want to throw them out. And I don't know whether he still, to the end of his life, thought it was a reasonable study and should have gotten more coverage. So it's really, so that's the background on sort of how people saw it. In terms of whether this becomes preventive history in some way, I don't know. I've talked to people who do, I don't know if you use this in Canada, but in the United States, a lot of people use an online ethics training program done by a group called CITI, C-I-T-I. I don't know if you use it up here. So I met with some of them to talk about how the Guatemala material might get into the study, but that's what I mean, into their protocol. But I don't know how much. Like, one of the things that's really interesting, my students, by the time I get them in class, barely anybody's ever heard about Tuskegee, and Guatemala just, came and went in a nanosecond. In part, I argue that at least with Tuskegee, the institute itself, and now the university at Tuskegee, was where Booker T. Washington is this famous figure in African-American education history. So people know about Tuskegee. And I think that helps make it possible for the name and the word to continue. And we have a large African-American population. It can stay inside the rumor and in the public knowledge there. But we don't have a lot of Guatemalan Americans. And as that cartoon showed, there's a lot of things that they're upset about with the United States, and this is really minor compared to everything else. And so I don't know who will carry this story forward. So I think it'll be interesting to see in 10 years, for example, what shows up in the bioethics training, textbooks, what shows up when you have to do, a training program for an IRB. And I don't know. I just don't know what effect it'll have.
Any other questions?
Hard to see because of the light. Sorry. Anybody else up there? Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for that talk. That was very, very enlightening. My question might call for some speculation, but how realistically, you know, outside academic circles, how feasible do you think it is to disprove this dichotomy of good and evil? I mean, considering that for the Tuskegee study, you yourself had to give up at some point because the media was just...
Right. I don't know. I'm an eternal optimist, so I mean, I think that the struggle is worth it. That's why I do this, why I give these lectures, why I try to write about this in multiple kinds of outlets, but particularly to try to talk to physicians about research, because I think, again, if we only make... And that's why, as I said, I wrote this paper for the History of Medicine meetings. And what I talked about in the argument in that paper was when we say history will be the judge, in the end, what you really mean is some historian, actually, is going to be the jury, the judge, the defense attorney, right, the prosecutor. And I was trying to think about my responsibility to Cutler, whose reputation I have now ruined for all of, you know, historical time, presumably. And I felt kind of like, well, what was my responsibility to understanding him and to thinking about this? And I was really struck when a friend of mine in bioethics said he had been in Egypt when the story broke, and a physician who had worked in sexual health, which is the area Cutler really does most of his work in, looked at my bioethics friend and said to him, oh my God, not our Dr. Cutler. So, you know, you have this sense that, you know, these are not monsters. These are just people who, you know, we give Nobel Prizes to people who push the edge, right, of research all the time. And I don't know what Cutler's fantasies were about what he was doing, but he was, in fact, thinking he was doing something. You can see that when he's speaking. We are in a war against this disease. I'm really trying to cure it. These people really gave their lives for a noble reason. And how many of us also think about that ourselves when we try to do really powerful research? And so I think trying to think honestly about him and to try to talk about that way is the responsibility of why, now here's my plug, why you need social medical sciences required courses in medical schools, please, thank you. My check's in the mail, right? You know, but why do we need to do this? Why do we have to talk to medical students about that kind of that's the difficult part when you're doing research. We have to think about who on the outside might help us think through these kind of materials, because we're not inside it. Why I think it's important to have community people on IRBs, for example, although I'm very aware of what the limitations are and the problems with the IRB. And I served for 4 years on an FDA commission as a, quote, consumer, so on an advisory board, so I know what happens. But I think all those things really matter, and I think that's all we can really do. I mean, we may not win, but we certainly have to wage that battle. Okay. Anybody else? Okay.
All right, so this marks the...
one more.
Okay, so we'll take one quick last question.
Thank you very much. I just wondered if you would care to comment on how you think we could or should, or how your research or your interpretation of your research could and should impact our planned medical curricula. You did imply that you did think that might be a role, and also how we could use this information and your viewpoints and your notion as a historian and a transdisciplinary oriented person when we're structuring IRBs and laws around other kinds of ethical.
Well, I mean, I'm obviously can't go sell myself out on the to make all that happen, but I think the more historians of medicine who know about this, who can bring it up, who can talk to you about it. I mean, I'm very aware that the 4 years in medical school is a nightmare of stuffing a million pieces of information. My goddaughter's about to graduate from Yale Medical School, and we talk about this all the time. But I think, you know, most historians of medicine certainly know this, my work, and have seen this, and I've gotten it out in as many places as I can manage at this point. I've moved on to other research right now, but I'm hoping that that will happen, that eventually people will start to talk about it this way and we'll get the material out. But I can't really, I don't have that kind of control over how it gets used. As I said, once it's out there in the public sphere, then anything can happen to it, and you just have to you know, not make yourself totally crazy over it. I mean, my poor husband can tell you how many times he's heard me running around the house screaming over something that I watched or listened to or on the radio and all of this stuff that I know is inaccurate and wrong. But I live in the United States right now, so believe me, this is minor compared to everything else that's going on in my country, as you can well imagine. So I don't know, but I think I mean, it's worth thinking about. It'd be love to have that discussion with you more fully. Thank you. And thank you very much for your time.